Good afternoon, all. This is TPB's work session to review the results, preliminary results of the climate change mitigation study. We will start in just a few minutes. Okay, Ms. Allen?
You may wait just one more minute or so and make sure folks are in. Or do you feel like we've got folks here? It looks like a pretty full panel from what I can tell.
32, 33 now.
Nice. All right, well, in the interest of time, then we'll go ahead and get started.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to kick us off. First off, welcome and good afternoon, everybody, to today's work session. I'm Charles Allen, Chair of TPB. I want to again thank everybody for making the time to fit this extra session into your calendars. We have typically just prior to the TPB board meeting. This month, we're holding it on a different day. I understand that the Metropolitan Washington Area Quality Committee is meeting just before the TPB meeting on Wednesday, and some of us on the TPB also serve on the MWAC. I can't get my acronym correct on that one. It's just quacks. So the work session is scheduled for today, so the members could attend the MWAC meeting on Wednesday. We're not going to be taking a roll call, but staff will note your participation through the chat window. The purpose of the work session is for us to get some more time than we would during a regular board meeting, so we can receive a detailed briefing on the climate change mitigation study. While the board will be briefed about this on Wednesday due to time limitations of that meeting, the briefing will be slightly abbreviated. My plan for the work session is to have staff and the consultant complete their presentation. Then we will turn and ask questions, and we'll do my best to manage that clock so that everyone has plenty of time to ask their questions. Please note the idea is not to have a discussion on what all of this means necessarily or what TPB would even do with this information. Those discussions are going to be held during the full board meeting. I suspect, frankly, that's going to be something that is part of our conversation for many months to come. For today, let's try to keep our questions to the assumptions that have been made for various scenarios or clarifications of the results of the analysis. With that, what I'm going to do is turn to our next item. I'm going to ask Conti to set the stage for this study and today's briefing. So Conti, let me turn to you for item number 2 in our agenda, the background and context for the study findings.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board. So the climate change mitigation study has been very timely and an important initiative of the board. The prominent role climate change figures in recent federal actions speak to the importance and the timeliness of this work. This study has also been an intensive work effort for staff and our consultant team. We've had less than 11 months to go from a board advice during the January meeting to complete the analysis and presenting the results today. So staff and our consultants have really worked long and hard, many late nights, many weekends. So if I may, I would like to take this moment to thank staff and the consultant team for their work. I've been involved in all of the TPB and COGS studies examining strategies to reduce greenhouse gases, both within the transportation sector and within all sectors combined. So from that vantage point, regarding this study, it is my belief that the scope of this analysis is very comprehensive, and the technical methods of the analysis are robust and consistent with the state of the practice for such a scenario planning work. And I trust that you will find this to be the case as you get the results briefed. I would like to make 4 points to put this TPB initiative in context before turning it over to Mark and Michael to present the results. First, by undertaking this study and other related actions that the TPB has taken in the past 10 months, the TPB has recognized that taking actions to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change is both a national and regional priority. The TPB announced this as one of the focus areas and a priority last year as part of endorsing the region's new greenhouse gas reduction goal for 2030, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% below 2005 levels. As part of its endorsement last year, the TPB affirmed its commitment to do its part within the transportation sector to reduce greenhouse gases. I say to do its part because it's worth noting that the regional greenhouse gas reduction goals, both for 2030 and 2050, are multi-sector and they are not sector specific, meaning the 50% and 80% greenhouse gas reduction goals are not distributed in any specific amounts to the energy sector, to the residential and commercial building sector, to the transportation or other sectors. Despite this, the TPB's approach since 2010 has been to take the regional reduction levels as applicable to transportation sector. This has meant TPB's approach has always been TPB is going to do all it can to reduce the greenhouse gases within the on-road sector by 50% by 2030 and by 80% by 2050. Second, the COG adopted multi-sector 2030 greenhouse gas reduction goals last year. When it did that, it did a preliminary analysis to determine if the region could indeed meet its new reduction goal if every sector took a set of actions to reduce greenhouse gases. And the answer of that analysis was yes, the region could indeed reach the aggressive 2030 goal if every sector did everything they could. For the transportation sector, the COG analysis examined two broad types of actions. One, converting the vehicles to clean fuel. Two, reducing the amount of on-road travel or reducing vehicle miles of travel, as some would refer to it. In January, with these two types of actions in mind, converting vehicles to clean fuel, reducing VMT, the TPB asked staff two specific questions. What types of actions and what level of outcome from those actions would be needed to reduce on-road sector's greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 and 80% by 2050? The climate change mitigation study answers these two questions. The third point is please keep in mind that the answers from this study is limited to reductions in greenhouse gases from the on-road sector one might expect by taking all of the actions that have been analyzed. By this, I mean, if in the presentation you see an answer that a certain scenario in transportation will not reduce greenhouse gases in transportation sector by 50%, it does not mean that the region cannot achieve its multi-sector reduction goal. The region could still achieve its multi-sector greenhouse gas reduction goal by 2030 because there would be actions taken from the other sectors as well. Similarly, if you hear an answer today that a particular scenario would indeed reduce greenhouse gas reductions on road by 50%, it does not mean that the region's multi-sector greenhouse gas reductions goals would be met if no other action is taken by their other sectors. Everybody would need to take the actions that they can. And the last point is to stay within the time and the funding resources that we had available for this study. This study utilized a scenario planning approach, which essentially means technically two things. First, the analysis is at an aggregate or a regional level, and it is not at the level of individual projects or programs. There are many individual projects or programs that can be implemented to arrive at a specific outcome. The analysis is just focused on the outcomes and not all the various different ways in which those outcomes could be achieved. The second point about scenario analysis is because it uses mostly sketch planning tools, the results of the analysis represent an order of magnitude estimate of the change in greenhouse gas emissions one might expect if all of these outcomes are achieved. It's not very precise, very accurate at that level. And the last thing I would note about this study, which has explored three high-level scenarios, and 10 detailed scenarios. Each of the 10 detailed scenarios is a combination of different strategies to achieve the outcomes, which is reducing greenhouse gases. So the levels of outcomes from these strategies varies between scenarios. So for example, in a particular scenario, we may have assumed the outcome to be reducing VMT by reducing transit fares by 40%. In a second scenario, we might assume reducing VMT by making transit fully free. So that is how different scenarios vary, right? Not only do the strategies vary, the level of implementation of the strategies also vary. So you may want to just please make a note of that. So you will hear shortly, and you will notice in the draft report that we have shared with you today, the strategies and the level of implementation that has been assumed in this study, in my opinion, are unprecedented and extremely aggressive. In making these assumptions, we intentionally did not ask questions such as, how would we achieve these levels of changes within these timeframes? Would we be able to enact these policies within our region? How would we secure community acceptance to implement these programs and policies? Or how much money would be needed to build, operate, and maintain these programs? We didn't ask any of these questions. We stayed focused on the questions that you asked us, which is what actions are needed, what levels of outcomes from those actions would need to be achieved. So in summary, the results will tell us where we will need to be in 2030 and 2050. It does not tell us how to get there. I believe how to get there will be the hardest part to figure out, and one that we will have to work together. I also believe that the outcomes identified in any of these scenarios cannot be achieved overnight. It will not only take several years, but it will require sustained commitment at all levels, at the local level, state level, federal level, from the private sector, and importantly from the public. And I do not believe that any of these will be easy, nor do I believe it will be cheap. But I do believe that the cost of inaction will be much higher. So that's the overall context in which you may want to accept the briefings and the results of this study. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Kanti. I already have thoughts and comments and questions, but in the interest of sticking to our agenda, I'm going to hold them until we get through the next part and then be able to turn into that. I have a hunch that many of my colleagues have the same. So we appreciate that. What we're going to do now is turn to Mark Moran from our staff, who's going to introduce Michael Grant and then kick off this briefing. After this briefing, then that's when we're going to turn to our questions and discussion phase. So Mark, let me turn to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Before I begin, I would like to thank our consultant, ICF, for the excellent work they've provided on this study. ICF is COG's planning services on-call consultant and has extensive experience in the area of climate change planning and mitigation. ICF has worked with two subcontractors for this study, Fair and Peers and Gallup Corporation. I would also like to thank two COG TPB staff, Aaron Morrow and Dujan Buxan, whose expertise and work has been pivotal to the success of this study. The last time we presented to the TPB on this topic was in September. So this afternoon, I'll be providing an overview of the study, and we'll go over the first 5 slides of the presentation. Michael Grant of ICF will then go over the remaining slides, and we'll discuss the findings from the analysis of the scenario study. On slide 2, we can see the 2 key goals of the study. First, to identify pathways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within the on-road transportation sector, commensurate with the region's 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas reduction goals. Second, to explore scenarios to understand what types of strategies are needed to achieve the goals and what level of GHG reductions might be achieved under different scenarios. Note that throughout this presentation, the term on-road refers to all emissions from roadway motor vehicles, including tailpipe, evaporative, and electricity-related emissions. Next slide, please. This study was divided into two phases. Phase 1 was conducted by the TPB staff and consisted of a review of past climate change studies conducted by both COG and TPB. Phase 1 concluded with a COG-TPB report dated March 2nd, 2021. Phase 2 was conducted by ICF and consisted of a literature review and a scenario analysis. The literature review was documented in an ICF report dated July 8th. Next, ICF, working with COG staff and input from the Tech Committee, developed a list of scenarios and greenhouse gas reduction strategies. This was documented in an ICF report dated August 25th. The study team developed 3 top-down scenarios and 10 bottom-up scenarios for a total of 13 scenarios. Next, ICF conducted its analysis of the 13 scenarios. A draft final report dated December 9th is available on the web page associated with this meeting. Today, we'll be presenting the major findings from the study. Slide 4, please. So there are many different strategies that can be used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Groupings of these strategies are called scenarios, and we tend to differentiate 3 main types of strategies, which we call pathways. The first pathway is called vehicle technology and fuels, which we refer to as VT for vehicle technologies. Examples include improving fuel economy of the vehicle fleet, advancing alternative fuels, accelerating the deployment of electric vehicles. The second pathway is called mode shift and travel behavior, which we refer to as MSTB or simply MS. Examples include mode shifts to transit, carpooling, and non-motorized modes such as walking and biking, reducing trip lengths such as bringing jobs and households together. And then the third pathway is called Transportation Systems Management and Operations, or TSMO. This includes enhancing incident management, improving signal coordination, and other operational strategies. It also includes reducing speeding and idling, eco-driving, and deployment of connected and automated vehicles, or CAVs. Next slide, please. So global warming is caused by an overabundance of one or more gases in the Earth's atmosphere. The best known of these gases is carbon dioxide, or CO2, but there are many others such as methane and hydrofluorocarbons. The net effect of all the Earth-warming gases is often expressed as a CO2 equivalent, or CO2e, which you see on this slide. At the bottom of the figure, we can see that mathematically, total greenhouse gas emissions is the product of 3 terms: vehicle travel activity, which can be expressed in vehicle miles of travel, or VMT, energy efficiency, which is measured in British thermal units per mile, and carbon intensity. The blue boxes represent the 3 pathways that we discussed on the previous slide. We can see that the MSTB affects vehicle travel activity, and vehicle operational changes affect energy efficiency. Lastly, vehicle fleet and fuel changes affect both energy efficiency and carbon intensity. The green box represents the electrical power sector. Changes in this sector affect carbon intensity. And then the 3 blue boxes can be grouped in terms of transportation strategies. Finally, at the very top of the figure is carbon pricing, which can affect all the transportation strategies and also the power sector. Carbon pricing is simply a way of putting a price on carbon or carbon dioxide. There's 2 principal ways to do this: a demand-side measure such as a carbon tax or carbon fee, and a supply-side measure such as an emissions trading scheme, a cap-and-trade system, or a cap-and-invest system. An example of the latter is the Transportation Climate Initiative, or TCI. Carbon pricing has been identified as a potentially promising technology, but this study did not explicitly analyze carbon pricing. However, it can be a mechanism that would help support other strategies analyzed under the study, such as shifts towards electric vehicles and less carbon-intensive modes of travel. Carbon pricing is viewed by economists as one of the most efficient ways to lower greenhouse gas emissions. About 15% of emissions across more than 80 countries or regions, including Canada, are currently subject to a carbon price. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michael Grant to finish the presentation.
Thank you, Mark. First of all, I wanted to acknowledge some of my colleagues, Mike McQueen and Adam McGallico, who are on the line today to potentially help answer questions, as well as the rest of the experts and team members at ICF and our subcontractors for the work that they really hard work they put into all of this. First, I'm going to provide some highlights of the results of the study analysis, starting with what we consider the top-down analysis that we conducted. We explored 3 questions as part of this analysis, addressing what would it take to meet the regional goals within the on-road transportation sector. First, if we focus solely on VMT reduction, and then looking at the issue if we focus solely on electric vehicle adoption. I'll go through some of these results fairly quickly. There's a lot of information here, and you'll see in the report. So I hope I can convey the information well. There certainly we're looking forward to your questions and have a lot more detail in the draft study report. I'll note that in response to a question we received from the TPB technical committee, we also conducted an additional analysis to answer the question about what level of VMT reduction would be needed to meet the regional 2030 goal, assuming the vehicle technology assumptions that are in the multi-sector 2030 Climate and Energy Action Plan. So in terms of results, we highlighted some of this previously at a meeting, but to reiterate, looking at VMT reduction alone, achieving the 2030 goal is extremely challenging. It would require passenger VMT, which is generally looked at as the vehicle travel in cars and light-duty trucks, such as pickup trucks, minivans, and SUVs. That level of VMT reduction would need to drop by about 57% from the 2018 level by 2030. On the right, you can see a chart showing the average daily passenger VMT per capita, and you can see that vehicle travel per person in the region is forecast to decline slightly under the baseline forecast, but that to reach the goal by 2030, a dramatic drop in VMT per person or per capita would be needed. This level of reduction, about a 57% reduction in VMT, or even a larger reduction in VMT per capita because of the region's population growth, really is an unprecedented level of reduction, with traffic volumes shrinking to levels that would be similar to at the height of the initial COVID-19 stay-at-home orders during April 2020, when essentially all but essential workers were told to stay home, schools were closed, and many other activities were curtailed. We find that it would not be possible to attain the 2050 goal through passenger VMT reduction alone, since medium and heavy-duty vehicles exceed the goal level of emissions. We also looked at the issue of what would it take to achieve the goals with technology alone, and focused on a fairly simplified analysis looking at shifts to electric vehicles, assuming proportionate adoption of electric vehicles across all vehicle classes. We found actually a very similar challenge for achieving the 2030 goal. Using a reference case of the carbon intensity from the electric grid, which assumes improvements beyond the current electric grid, and we'll talk a little bit further about this later. But using that reference case of carbon intensity for the electricity grid, we estimate that achieving the goal would require about 75% of the vehicles on the road to be electric vehicles by 2030. Under a scenario that assumes a clean energy grid by 2035, so that the electricity is producing essentially zero emissions, still nearly half of the vehicles on the road would need to be electric vehicles. And you'll see in the graphic on the right, this is actually the case with the clean grid case, where by 2030, you see with the blue area, a dramatic increase in the share of vehicle travel that would need to be made by electric vehicles. One point is to remember that this is only about 9 years away or less, and people tend to hold on to their vehicles for many years, often 10 years or more. So the level of vehicles on the road being electric is extremely ambitious. President Biden has launched an ambitious target for 50% of the new light-duty passenger vehicles sold in 2030 to be electric. But here in this case, we're talking about nearly half to about 3/4 of all of the vehicles that are actually operating on our roadway system in 9 years needing to be electric, which, as you can imagine, is extremely challenging to imagine. The 2050 goal actually cannot be achieved through shifts to electric vehicles alone if we assume the carbon intensity of the electric grid based on current policies. But under the case of a truly clean carbon grid, as shown in this graphic here, it would be possible to achieve the goal through technology improvements if nearly 80% of the vehicles on the road would be electric. We then explored the new analysis of what VMT reduction would be required under the region's climate and energy action plan's vehicle technology assumptions, and estimated that passenger VMT or VMT in light duty cars and trucks would still need to drop by nearly half, or by about 49% from the 2018 level. This is compared to the 57% reduction in VMT we estimated, in passenger VMT we estimated would be needed in the case without those additional vehicle technology improvements. One issue, again, is that while the Climate and Energy Action Plan assumes substantial increases in electric vehicle adoption, it's still only a fraction of the total vehicle fleet. It assumed about 34% of cars and 17% of light-duty trucks on the road would be electric by 2030, and lower shares for medium and heavy-duty trucks. Also, the passenger VMT reduction is primarily focused on shifting people from driving to transit, ride sharing, biking and walking and other modes, but does not address commercial vehicles and freight trucks, which make up about 1/4 of all of the on-road emissions. So again, this analysis highlights the real challenges facing the on-road transportation sector in meeting the 2030 emissions reductions associated with the region's 50% reduction goal. We then looked at exploring a combination of strategies that could potentially meet the regional goals within the on-road transportation sector by developing a set of 10 scenarios that address an array of different transportation strategies and combinations of strategies. This slide shows the 10 scenarios we analyzed, each of which is very aggressive in terms of assumptions. There were 2 scenarios focused on vehicle technologies and fuels, both of which we consider aggressive, but one of which is somewhat less than the technology assumptions in the Climate and Energy Action Plan, and the second of which is even more aggressive in terms of technology adoption. We also analyzed 3 different mode shift and travel behavior scenarios encompassing a wide array of strategies, including land use, transit, travel demand management, and telework. Based on feedback from the TPB, we adjusted how the scenarios were defined, and the second scenario, mode shift scenario, includes road pricing, and the third most aggressive scenario added on top of the assumptions from the first and second mode shift scenarios, additional assumptions that amplified the effects, such as more aggressive assumptions about telework, parking pricing, and transit price and service enhancements. We also explored one scenario focused on transportation system management and operations, and then 4 scenarios that included a combination of strategies. You'll see these combinations paired the less aggressive scenarios first, and then combine one scenario with the more aggressive technology emphasis, one with the more aggressive mode shift emphasis, and a final combination that includes the most aggressive strategies across all of the different pathways. It's important to note that the emissions from electric vehicles depend on the profile of electricity generation, and we developed 3 different cases that were applied to the results for the electric grid. As more vehicles become electric, and particularly under our scenarios with advanced technology, the role of the electric grid in overall emissions becomes more important. It's important to note that we have a reference case here, which assumes a cleaner electric grid than today. It's not assumed to be static or the same grid assumptions as or grid that we have in place today, but it is based on existing policies for increasing use of renewable fuels and is somewhat similar to the electric power assumptions in the Climate and Energy Action Plan for 2030. It includes significant improvements compared to the current grid. And so it's important to note that if those policy goals are not achieved in the electricity sector, it'll make it even more difficult for the transportation goals to be met. The other cases go even further in terms of more renewables to an assumption about a completely carbon neutral grid by 2035. In that case, in our analysis, there are completely zero emissions from electricity. As a reminder, we have relied primarily on sketch planning tools and models to analyze the strategies, and particularly for the mode shift and travel behavior strategies, we want to note that we used the regional travel model to analyze land use changes, but then layered on analyses using a sketch planning tool called TRIMS, which was developed by the Center for Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida to analyze strategies such as transit enhancements and pricing strategies. And then we combine this with spreadsheet analyses to analyze telework and TISMO strategies and bike ped and other based on results of literature and other study findings. These types of tools and sketch planning approaches are widely used for this type of scenario study, but we want to note that there are some limitations to them. They're generally based on standard relationships, for instance, between the price of travel and travel demand, and generally don't account well for indirect effects. So there are some, levels of uncertainty that we should acknowledge among the strategies and can be fairly high for some strategies. So we believe it's important to consider the results in regard to the relative magnitude of effects and not as precise figures for each individual scenario. So I'll provide findings from the analysis of the bottom-up scenarios, which I think is probably some of the most important and interesting results we have here today. So this slide shows the results under our reference electric grid assumptions. And note that I noted earlier, the reference electric grid assumption assumes current on-the-books policies for the electric grid that have some improvements in the level of carbon emissions from electricity. But you'll see from this analysis, actually, in 2005, the level of on-road greenhouse gas emissions was approximately 20.75 million metric tons. So that's just above the top line of this graph here, which goes up to 20 million metric tons. You'll see under the baseline assumptions on the left-hand side, greenhouse gas emissions are estimated to be reduced about 14% to a bit under 18 million metric tons. This is based on the existing plans in the region and assumptions around vehicle technologies. In 2030, the light blue bars, you'll see that none of the scenarios, unfortunately, meet the 50% reduction goal, but all of them do contribute important reductions. In particular, the vehicle technology scenarios and the mode shift and travel behavior scenarios yield reductions of about 20 to 28% compared to the 2005 level, and the combinations perform even better. By 2050, the vehicle technology scenarios you can see in the dark blue bars generate the largest estimated emissions reductions, as these scenarios involve large shifts to electric vehicles, and the combination scenarios that combine technology and mode shift strategies together yield the largest reductions. Although when you get to scenarios that the most aggressive vehicle technology scenarios that have a large share of vehicles being electric, at that point the benefit of reducing each additional vehicle mile on the road is less. Here, this chart probably has the most information of any slide we have, and you can see the results for 2030 and 2050 under all of the electric grid scenarios. So you'll see here we have rows for each of the different 10 scenarios in addition to the baseline. And we also have results for 2030 and 2050 for each of the 3 electric grid assumptions. Note that in the baseline forecast, as I noted earlier, building on assumptions in the visualized 2045 plan, greenhouse gas emissions are estimated to be approximately 14% below the 2005 level in 2030 and approximately at the same level in 2050. And we developed the forecast for 2050 building on analyses through 2045 and different assumptions around vehicle travel and emissions factors. An important note here is that we applied a very aggressive combination of strategies, but none of the scenarios, as I noted, achieved the 50% reduction goal by 2030 when focusing on on-road greenhouse gas emissions. So you'll see none of these are, in 2030 are shown in green. Even the most aggressive combination of strategies generally were estimated to result in emissions levels about 30 to 40% below the 2005 figure. On the bright side, we wanted to note that the 2030 Climate and Energy Action Plan is a multi-sector plan, as Conti noted, and showed how to potentially achieve the region's goals through greenhouse gas reductions across many sectors, including residential and commercial buildings, solid waste, aviation, and other sectors. Looking at the level of reductions from on-road sources that was assumed in the Climate and Energy Action Plan, several of the scenarios do achieve emissions reductions at levels that meet or exceed that level of reduction, and those are highlighted here in yellow. Those generally are the scenarios that involve a combination of strategies, and particularly those that with the cleaner grid, you'll see some benefit there too. Looking at the 2050 goal, only the most aggressive combination of strategies under the reference electric grid case meets the 80% reduction goal. So you'll see the one green box here under the reference grid for 2050. However, with a cleaner electric grid, several of the scenarios that include technology improvements do meet the goal. You'll notice that the electric grid becomes more important, in particular for scenarios that involve shifts to electric vehicles, particularly in 2050 when the scenarios move towards having the vast majority of vehicles on the road being assumed to be electric at that point. I'll just go through fairly briefly a little bit more about each of the scenarios just to give you a little bit more context about what was in each and what the analysis found and some of the assumptions with each. So these will just some quick highlights, and we're happy to answer questions. Under the baseline forecast, we want to note that the 2050 baseline forecast builds on 2045 data through 2045 and extends that further. The region's population is expected to grow considerably over this time, about 12% by 2030 and about 28% by 2050. The fleet moves towards electric vehicles slowly under this scenario, but what you'll notice here, this is based on the land use and transportation assumptions in Visualized 2045 and anticipated fleet makeup. The emissions, as we noted, are estimated to decrease by about 14% from the 2005 level. This is during a time when population, as I noted, is expected to grow. Under the vehicle technology and fuels improvement scenario, the first one, we assumed a significant increase in electric vehicle sales, resulting in an estimate that about 26% of cars and 9% of light-duty trucks on the road would be electric in 2030, and that by 2050, over 92% of light-duty vehicles on the road would be electric. This is based on assumptions, as you see here, based on vehicle sales and doing some analysis using the vision model or from a tool that helps to forecast how much of that makes it into the vehicle fleet. We also made some assumptions about the use of biodiesel and renewable diesel, which reduces emissions from diesel vehicles somewhat as well. Overall, you see that the technology shift plays a large role in emissions reductions by 2050 in particular as the fleet turns over, and having the cleaner electric grid plays an important role in meeting the goals as most vehicles are electric. The short time frame for vehicle fleet to turn over by 2030, as noted earlier, though, still makes it challenging to meet the 2030 50% goal. We then looked at an amplified technology and fuels improvement scenario, which advanced the sales targets for electric vehicles and increased the share of biofuels assumed. Under this scenario, all new light-duty passenger vehicles sold in 2030 are assumed to be electric vehicles, which is very ambitious and actually goes even beyond California's goals, which are that 100% of new passenger cars and trucks sold in the state would be zero emissions vehicles by 2035. And the medium and heavy duty sales figures that we used in this scenario are similarly ambitious. Given the time frame of fleet turnover, it's estimated that under this scenario of new sales, which, as I just noted, moves very rapidly towards sales of electric, about 1/3 of the light duty vehicles, cars, and passenger cars and trucks on the road would be electric by 2030. So it makes a sizable movement towards larger greenhouse gas reductions in 2030. And by 2050, nearly all light duty vehicles would be electric, and over 3/4 of medium and heavy duty trucks would be electric as well, which is why you see such significant reductions. Looking at the mode shift scenarios, we wanted to note the first mode shift scenario includes a wide array of strategies, including land use changes, reduced transit fares, improvements in transit travel times, and substantial levels of telework, as well as other supporting pricing strategies. In total, the strategies are estimated to reduce passenger VMT or VMT in cars and light-duty trucks by about 10% in 2030 and 13% in 2050 compared to the baseline forecast. And at these levels, passenger VMT in 2030 would be just under the 2018 level, despite over a 12% increase in regional population. The land use changes in 2030 have relatively limited effect since there's relatively few years of development that is altered, but those effects of land use and other strategies increase over time by 2050. But there are high levels of uncertainty with some of the strategies like reduced transit fares and telework. And we wanted to note that telework makes a fairly large impact on the work trips, but literature suggests that people who telework also make additional non-work trips. So our analysis incorporated assumptions that use the best literature on the overall effects of telework. Yet there are uncertainties around those. And in addition to some people making offsetting increases in non-work trips, as significantly fewer people are on the roads during peak hours, there may also be some increased demand for driving. Just as while the transit improvements that improve transit times would encourage a shift by some drivers to transit, large amounts of telework may reduce roadway congestion in ways that also improves driving times and might encourage some offsetting shifts back to driving. We've seen this somewhat during the pandemic as peak period traffic congestion has been reduced and some people may make more driving trips, or if they go into the office only some days a week, might choose to drive those days rather than take transit. So there's a lot of uncertainties around this, but the analysis provides a general range of results. We did not specifically account for some additional benefits associated with traffic flow improvements from reduced VMT, and so that might also generate some additional small benefit of potentially 1 to 2%. The second mode shift scenario added road pricing on top of the scenario from the first mode shift scenario, and added VMT fees for all drivers and cordon pricing for trips traveling into downtown DC. The incremental reduction in passenger VMT is notable, with an estimated 14% reduction in passenger VMT in 2030 compared to the baseline forecast and a 20% reduction in 2050. Under these results, passenger VMT or VMT in cars and light duty trucks would be considerably lower than the 2018 level by 2030 and still lower than 2018 levels by 2050, despite about a 28% increase in regional population. So it makes a notable difference. But again, there are uncertainties about the effects of road pricing, with some literature suggesting the possibility of higher impacts and some suggesting the effects may not be as large. Over the past year, gas prices have increased over $1 a gallon, which is almost equivalent to a 5-cent per mile increase. Yet it's somewhat unclear to what extent drivers have been that responsive to that price change in terms of reducing VMT compared to what it would have been at a lower price. Finally, the third mode shift scenario basically added amplified assumptions for some of the strategies, with free transit for all, further improvements in transit service times, and a very large increase in telework, assuming about 40% of all regional workers telework on an average day. Given that we estimate what you might consider office workers or people who are have jobs that are most amenable to telework, make up about half of the worker population. This suggests about 80% of them would be working from home on an average day, meaning that that typical employee would only go into an office 1 day a week. This scenario yields about a 20% reduction in passenger VMT in 2030 and a 25% reduction in 2050 compared to the baseline forecast. And under this scenario, passenger VMT in 2030 is actually below the level it was in 2005. And it's about at the same 2005 level in 2050, despite the region growing from about 5 million people in 2005 to about 7.1 million in 2050. Again, the effects of sustained telework are somewhat uncertain, but these provide range, basically an estimate of what may be possible from those amplified scenarios. The TSMO scenario assumed extensive deployment of operational strategies, such as intelligent transportation systems, and incident management and other programs to improve traffic flow. And it's based on simulation studies from the San Francisco Bay Area and previous work for the TPB's Long Range Plan Task Force, which examined an operational improvement scenario, which had estimated about a 1% reduction in regional on-road transportation greenhouse gas emissions. So our findings here have a pretty small effect, but some benefit. And by 2050, we've estimated or assumed higher benefits due to assumptions regarding eco-driving for connected and automated vehicles. And eco-driving is assumed to have about a 2% reduction in on-road emissions. These were applied to the conventional vehicles that use a gasoline and diesel, not to electric vehicles. But in the baseline forecast, we have relatively limited electric vehicles. And then our combined scenarios provide, you can see here, the largest benefit. So you can see under here the impacts of each of the scenarios. Each of these bars represents one of the combination scenarios. And you can see this in relation to the 50% goal by 2030 and the 80% goal by 2050. So under the clean grid scenario, we see that all of the combination strategies achieve the 80% reduction goal. By 2050, the power grid plays an important role in achieving the 80% reduction goal, as you can see here with the clean grid, under the clean grid scenario, where all of these combinations meet the goal. Under our reference grid, only the most aggressive set of strategies across all meet the goal. Over time, the mode shift and travel behavior strategies do become relatively less important in 2050, since at that point in our combination scenarios, nearly all passenger vehicles are assumed to be electric. So key conclusions here, and then we'll wrap up for questions, is that we see that achieving a 50% reduction in on-road greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 is extremely ambitious. None of the scenarios we analyzed were estimated to achieve the goal, And frankly, there's just very little time to get to the level of vehicle technology adoption or VMT reduction that would be needed to meet the goal. We do see that the on-road transportation sector, however, can contribute substantial greenhouse gas reductions to support the region's goal as part of a multi-sector approach, and several scenarios with a combination of strategies that include technology and mode shift and travel behavior could achieve the level of on-road reductions in the multi-sector 2030 climate and energy action plan. Achieving the 80% reduction in on-road greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 is more attainable, relying on vehicle technology advancements, and particularly is supported by a clean electric grid. The goal is only met with our most aggressive scenario under the reference case electric grid, which includes significant mode shift strategies as well. However, with the cleaner electric grid, we see more opportunities for this reduction to occur. The mode shift and travel behavior strategies provide supporting greenhouse gas reductions, but are less important in the case where nearly all vehicles are electric and the electric grid is clean. So we just, again, wanted to highlight there are study limitations to this. There are limited assessments of some secondary effects, such as how telework might influence changes in locations of businesses, how VMT might be adjusted through impacts on traffic flow on the network from reduced VMT, shifts to EVs that could potentially induce additional driving if the cost of driving is reduced. There are uncertainties regarding the effects of changes in price and how those particularly large price changes such as free transit would influence travel behavior. And then there are implementation considerations about getting to the results. We made some assumptions about levels of transit service improvements or levels of EV adoption or levels of telework, but how would we get to those levels of transit service improvement or EVs or telework is another question in terms of policy and incentives and investments. There are also implications for greenhouse gas emissions in other sectors that were not considered, such as impacts that there may be on building energy consumption. So just highlight a few implementation considerations here. We do note that there are a lot of co-benefits to many of these strategies, which is important to keep in mind. And under equity considerations, there are a number of things to consider here. There are some potential concerns about some of the strategies to keep in mind. For instance, electrification in terms of access to charging infrastructure, which may be difficult for some population segments, such as in multifamily housing. Telework may not be applicable, is not often applicable for workers in many service industries and may have impacts on businesses with lower income workers. Parking pricing, cordon pricing, and other pricing strategies can increase costs and could affect lower income households, but fees can be designed or thought about with equity in mind, accounting for different factors like household income. At the same time, there are a lot of opportunities to enhance equity through strategies that relate to land use, transit, bicycle, pedestrian, and other types of improvements. And finally, we just note implementation considerations. That's not the focus of this study, but potential role of the federal government, the private sector, intergovernmental cooperation. These are all things to consider in terms of how to get to these levels of sort of impacts, and also need to consider effects on transportation revenues and expenditures, as well as social and economic effects. So with that, I'll conclude and open to questions.
Thanks so much, Mr. Grant. All right, so here's what we're going to try to do to best use our time. We've got about 20 minutes or so. We're trying to wrap up at 4:15. A quick reminder, because if you're like me, the wheels are turning and you're asking yourselves the what does it all mean, where do we go type of questions. That's going to be part of our conversation for the TPB board meeting. Our work session, we're trying to focus our questions in really on what questions do you have around the assumptions that were used in this? What type of clarifications do you need about the results of the analysis? And then we're going to have that little bigger questions coming up. I will also note, and Conti suggested this, anybody feel free to go ahead and start doing it now. You can post your questions about the assumptions or results in the chat. And what that's going to allow staff to do is make sure they can collect all those to be able to get those responses together and share it on Wednesday. And then lastly, what I'll do my best, rather than doing our normal like one jurisdiction at a time, because that can be unfair to whoever's the last jurisdiction to go. What I'll do is try my best just to see hands from different jurisdictions and do my best to kind of spread it around so nobody ends up going last. That said, I'll at least ask one question first. I think that this is sobering, as it was the first time it was presented to us. I think it really highlights how urgent all of this is, and also that transportation alone is not going to be the solution. It's important. I want to note, I really appreciate you putting in that equity slide around those concerns being highlighted. I think that's important for us to keep in mind. That said, every time I heard you say this strategy is aggressive or that goal is aggressive, all I was really hearing you say was this is unrealistic. Seeing things like we'd be at 100% EVs by 2030, that's just unrealistic. And I think it's hard to square that. So I guess what I think that, we have I think and this will be part of the board conversation, looking at things like our VMT and other places are where we have a lot of strategies that can be gained. Our energy grid is a huge part of that. But if I am going to focus in on the EVs for a second, can you walk us through how you based the assumptions of charging infrastructure? Right now, you can't, there's no place to charge your EV. If you want to do it at your home, it's, depending on your jurisdiction, there's still a lot of hoops to go through. It takes hours in most cases to get a full charge. The infrastructure just doesn't exist, and it certainly is not going to be in place by 2030 to meet some of these goals. Can you walk me through how you based your assumptions around electric vehicles in a way that then plug in and work with this? That I'm having a hard time kind of seeing that, or what assumptions you used.
I will just note, and others on the team can chime in too, but that we did not, in a sense, do an analysis of the infrastructure, the incentives, the kinds of policies and investments that would be needed to get to this level of electric vehicles. We kind of made a sort of a determination of what level of new electric vehicle sales would occur in 2030 or beyond. And we based that off of some, other kinds of aggressive assumptions. So in our initial scenario for the VT1, oops, I think I dropped out of that image. The assumption was that about the new sales sort of matched with the president's goal about 50% of new sales being EVs in 2030. Then we had a more aggressive assumption that went way beyond, that assumed 100% by 2030. That may not be entirely realistic, but we were kind of pushed to see what might it take to get to the goals, and could it get to the goal. We found it still wouldn't get to the goal for 2030.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I know time is really short.
Oh, yeah.
I guess I'm not asking about the assumptions of the sales. If you don't have a place to charge, if we don't have the charging infrastructure in place, that's what I'm trying to understand. Like, did you look at how you assume the different jurisdictions or region is growing its charging infrastructure that plays into that numbers, or was it just based off of the assumptions of what those sales would be?
It was based off the
if you don't have a place to charge it, doesn't matter what the sales are.
Yeah, Mr. Allen, if I could respond, this analysis just assumed whatever enabling infrastructure would be needed would also have to be provided, and it would indeed be provided. We were focusing on the outcomes. If we achieved this level of EVs, then we would reduce greenhouse gases by this much. So you're absolutely right. That's kind of why I said these assumptions are aggressive and unprecedented, both on shifting mode, reducing VMT, and clean vehicle adaptation on both fronts. These are quite aggressive.
Got it. Okay. I see Mr. Collins, you have your hand up, so let me turn to you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Mr. Chair, you used the term sobering, and that, and that was kind of reflecting the same way. I think it's a very important analysis, but what struck me more than anything else is the buy-in will inevitably come from the various legislatures in the DMV. I mean, because at the end of the day, strategically looking at strategies to actually implement and eventually reach the goals will include, for example, a total revisit of how funding for transit in the state of Maryland, as an example, is implemented. And so one of the things I was thinking about was because I did get on late, but I was curious as to, in terms of looking at how it could be implemented, strategically coupling this with, for example, like shifting to like a VMT tax, something that would create like a revenue source. Those are the kind of things I was looking at, and the bottom line, because I know there's plenty of other questions, but I'd like to see where, as part of the study, there's a look at how you can kind of create that next level of thinking for the various legislatures in the state of Maryland, because you have a mix of very rural areas in the states, in comparison to more urban areas in the states. And so the gas tax and how we actually implement that is, something that really needs to be fleshed out.
Thanks, Mr. Collins. Mr. Grant, did you want to respond at all to that? No, okay.
I think those are, as Conti said, more for the kinds of policy discussions that will have to occur after this study.
Yeah. Well, I know Mr. Collins' wheels are turning like mine to longer board conversation too. Ms. Kostick, I see your hand up as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for the presentation. My mind is also spinning on the implications of all of this. And I guess one thing I'd like just to toss out as we think towards the larger board discussion is how we can take what's rather sobering and rather depressing and not just throw up our hands and say, well, let's not do anything, but try to find some way to make it actionable. So I don't know if there's some way in the data or the information that we get to kind of think through that a little more in a concerted way. My two kind of more technical questions I just wanted to toss out were, first of all, I was curious whether the baseline that you looked at assumed that all the transportation projects in Visualize 2045 went through and were completed, and if there was any value in looking at sort of an alternative that assumed nothing was done between now and then, and we had something more similar to the current transportation network that we have. And then my second question was with regard to telework. If there is a value in considering and whether anybody's been discussing the potential of telework to actually reduce some level of regional growth. So not having as many people necessarily moving into the region from outside if more jobs are telework focused.
I'll just highlight for the baseline, we did use the figures that came out of the Visualize 2045. We did not look at any other assumptions. That was kind of our base assumption moving forward, and all of these strategies were built off of that baseline, which was extended through 2050.
Ms. Kostick, if I could address the second question, it's not just teleworking that might have an impact on future economic growth of this region. Every one of these strategies, we have tested putting a carbon price to come in and out of DC, $10 a trip. It's still not doing the job. It will have some impact on growth, wouldn't it? So every one of these strategies, and we are talking about VMT price on top of existing gas prices and what have you. So these are really, that's kind of why we said, let's not, if we try to second guess policymakers, these assumptions would have been very anemic. So we said, no, let's leave it till another day to discuss how to get there. But I completely agree with you the intent here is not to say, forget this. No, the intent is to say, can we start moving towards this now? And let us see how quickly we can get there. If we don't get there by 2030, that's fine. We still are moving, right? We'll start walking, then we'll start running, and then we'll see how quickly we can get there.
Thanks. I don't see any other hands up at the moment. Kind of picking up on that point, Conti, I guess to Mr. Grant as well. So I completely agree with the comment of like, this is daunting, but that shouldn't be the reason not to do something, right? That we have to figure out what those action plans are. Does the way in which you've structured or laid out different scenarios and where you think goals will be met also include the performance targets or benchmarks to measure along the way as to how to get there? Or did you leave that more to whatever TPB and COG look at, that they would establish what those benchmarks and performance metrics would look like? Like, is there maybe kind of a little bit more behind the scenarios that you laid out for us of the 2030 and 2050 goals? Or is that really more up for the body to figure out?
Yeah, I would say we didn't develop any sort of interim metrics or performance measures. We certainly did look at VMT as one of the factors that influence the greenhouse gases and the emissions rates of those vehicles. So you could look at, there is some kind of data behind these that could potentially be used to look at, and track performance against those types of metrics. But I mean, in some ways, 2030 is pretty near term, and in many ways, when you're thinking about transportation investments and policies and programs. So I think that's partly why you see that being more challenging to meet some large goal.
Right. We didn't focus on which of these, for example, 10 scenarios, like Ms. Kostick was saying, if the region could get behind and say, we like combo 3, yes, we understand all of that will be difficult and hard. Let us all, if we can get behind combo 3, let's pursue towards that. If we get to that point, then we can try and establish, we can open the box of combo 3. What are all the assumptions made? And then we can start monitoring, are we getting there, right? So for example, in combo 3 or in the mode shift strategies, we took the official forecast of jobs and housing in the region and where they are supposed to happen. And we said, let's not accept that as given. Let us move them around as if we could move them around. So we moved them around across jurisdictional boundaries. We said, no, this is not where the growth is going to happen. It's going to happen on this side, so that jobs and housing are balanced in every jurisdiction, which will reduce at least work travel, right? So we did that. And that is what is included here. And then we said, okay, our planning directors have said, this is how many housing units we can expect by 2030. We said, no, we need more housing units. We added 77,000 more housing units between now and 2030 on top of what has been planned. We added 126,000 more housing units on top of what has been forecast for 2050. And those additional housing units were put where there are more jobs. Should the jurisdiction say, I will get you the approval and revisions to our comp plan to build those housing units to where those jobs are, or we will work to move some of the jobs to where there is more housing, those are the kinds of conversations we can have. And those are the kinds of policy decisions that would have to be made before they start being reflected in our long-range transportation plan. Same thing on fare. Transit, if we can all get behind, transit fares will be free. It will get us some reduction, not significant in VMT. By itself, it won't be significant. But if we can get behind that, we'll say, okay, let us see. We have 14 different operators. Next year, 2 of them are free. Year after that, maybe 4 of them are free. How soon can we get to all 14 being free? So those kinds of monitoring could be done once there is an indication that this is what we will be pursuing. And each jurisdiction is going to be pursuing a slightly different strategy. And that is also a second reason why this analysis is not at an individual project level. The primary reason is the tool cannot handle that. The tool can only handle at a regional level. But each jurisdiction will probably pursue what works best for them. And there might be some strategies that more than one jurisdiction, hopefully all 23 jurisdictions can say, we will all work towards that.
Yep. Any other questions? I don't think I see any other hands up. All right. Then I believe, let's see if I can my screen here. I would think then that we're pretty much close to adjourning then. What I would say is if you have any other questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat or obviously send those directly to Conti. We'll make sure that folks can get those responses in time for next for our meeting. And then our conversation obviously is a little bit different at the full board as we aren't necessarily talking about what are the underlying assumptions, but then start to think through some of the bigger questions and where we go. And then as I said, I think as TPB then starts into the next year, this will certainly be a topic where this conversation that's upcoming at the board won't be the last one. So I have a strong feeling that that work's going to continue for the months ahead into the new year. So I know there's good leadership that's going to help carry that forward too. So unless Conti, anything else, I think we're ready to wrap up here and then take it to the board shortly.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And you have a copy of the draft technical report where all of the details, these numbers that many of us were citing, it's all in the technical report. It's about 89 pages, but please review. It's a draft. We are working with the tech committee to see if those need to be further revised and simplified, which we will do. Our game plan is to have the final report ready for reference in January.
All right, sounds great. All right, well, thank you, everybody. And Mr. Moran, Mr. Grant, thank you very much for the presentation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leo.
Yes, thank you, Leo.
No problem.
Mark?
Thanks.
Mark, do you want to hang on?
Sure.
Do you need me?
No, Lynn. Fine, thanks.